Hello, I'm Adele from Purple Quilting. Thank you for joining me. I did a video recently where I went through loading the quilt with the red snapper system on my frame, and I just thought that on this next quilt I would just quickly go through how I baste it, just because that's a question that I had a lot when I started out long arming. There are various ways of doing it. There are loads and loads of different ways, as there is with everything. This is just what I found works for me. So similar to the previous quilt that I'd loaded, if you have seen that video, I have an extra wide backing. So while the quilt top is actually approximately centered on the centering tape, which isn't always the case and wasn't actually planned, was just luck, it's not centered on the backing. So I have more backing on the left-hand side than I do on the right. I have given myself a good 6-7 inches over on this side, so I've got loads and loads of space, but I have got a little bit more in there just to give me, again, a chunk of usable fabric on that side. So if I was more sensible, the thing that I would have done when I was loading this is I would have kept it so that the backing and the top of the quilt were closer to me in the frame space, because it's just easier to work here than it is to work here. But as with large chunks of my life, laziness has overtaken common sense, and it'll be fine. Between the machine being really easy to move about and using the channel locks and various other things, I don't think it's going to be, well, it's not usually an issue. But if it's something that you want to keep a really close eye on, or if you've got a really challenging quilt, so if it is really wavy and you're going to have to do quite a bit of manipulating, isn't quite the right word, but if you're going to have to smooth it out and ease it a little bit more, the closer that is to you, the easier it will be to do. So you would then just baste the top, and then you would move it on and baste down your sides. So I baste a throat space at a time, just as I advance. So as I say, this will be the two side edges that I can fit into my throat space and the top edge. So the only thing I did notice on this backing is it has got a little hole in it there, so I don't want to go any higher up than that. So my machine's going to stay there. So I'm just going to turn my channel lock on there, and then I know I'm going to miss the hole. So as I said, when I've looked at this is a block-based quilt. Again, let's just deal with the elephant in the room at this stage. So my piecing is far from perfect. This is another one of my quilts. So we're going to see some fullness in this, and that's okay. It's absolutely fine. We'll deal with it, and it'll look fabulous when it's finished. But yeah, there are some bits that are not as perfect as they could be. But anyway, moving on. One of the first things that you want to do is to give yourself a plumb line, which means that you're just going to do a completely straight line, which is just going through the backing and the batting or wadding. And then that's what we're going to use to line everything else up with. So I'm going to do that first. This is again another huge quilt, so it may be a slight challenge to see everything, but we'll do our best. So hopefully that's an okay angle to see a bit of the quilt with. But yeah, so all I'm going to do is do a plumb line. So that's just a totally straight line at the back of the quilt. So I've brought my thread up and I've got my channel lock on, so I'm just going to do a straight line. So now with that nice straight line, what I'm going to do is move my quilt so that it lines up exactly with that line. And that looks pretty good. Everything will shift a little bit as we're sewing, so it's just a case of keeping an eye on it and keeping it in line. So again, as we were saying before, the center of my quilt is around about the center on my tape, and so this side I have it at 43.5 inches, and this side it's at 43. So I know that that's where my two edges should be. The one of the most accurate ways to do it is to pin both edges where they should be and then use some pins to keep it in line. And that's certainly what I would be doing if there's a client quilt. If it's one of mine, then I often will do it without pinning because I'm not a pinner. But because this is such a huge one, I think there is some waviness in the borders, and I'm attempting to show people how it should be done rather than just how I might do it. I will pop some pins in. So that's a little bit wavy, but it'll be fine. And what I like to do is I like to do the center and the edges and then center each section, if that makes sense. So if I do, so the center of the quilt's over here, so I popped a pin in there first, and then I did the edge, and then I put one approximately in the center, and then I would put one in the center of that piece, and then the center of that piece, and so on and so on and so on, until I was happy that I had enough pins that it was keeping it where I wanted it to be. Okay, that's enough pins for me. So what I'm going to do next is pop that up a little bit, a bit less of a wonk. Is I'm just going to pop my machine onto baste mode. And the other thing that I learned recently, I'm going to put a little bit, which I'm really, really, really loving, is in prostitcher, you've got the move function. And that's what I'm going to use to baste my machine. So if this is set on continuous and stitch, when I press one of these arrow buttons, the machine will start stitching in that direction, and it will just keep going until I tell it to stop. If you take off continuous, then it will do a stitch, but it won't keep on going. You'll have to press it each time, I believe. I've not tried that. And if you take off stitch, it will move the machine, but obviously not so. So one of the things that I really like about using the move function is that when I have a particularly wavy border, or one that needs a little bit of kind of support, with this one you can see there's kind of like a little ruckle there, and you would normally try and put a bit of pressure behind the needle to keep it nice and straight. And what I find is, just because I've got little hands, I find it difficult to put that pressure on, keep the machine straight and exactly where I want it to be, even with the channel locks, and move it at the same time where putting the pressure everywhere that I want to put it. Whereas if I have both hands, I can just use them on either side of the machine as it's moving itself, and that's just so much easier. So I'm going to start in the center and move out in both directions, because that's a little bit easier just to keep it square again. Because you're not just shifting, if it's moving, you're not just moving all of the fullness to one edge. You're managing it in both halves, if that makes sense. So, just going to pull up my thread first. And I'm going about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. I'm going to take that first pin out, and I am going to do just a couple of stitches just to secure it. And then I'm going to use the move function. And while it seems painfully slow, it's so much more accurate. It's actually worth taking the flat and pretty square. So I'm happy with how that's basted. So we're ready to move on to the quilting.